Hey guys, welcome back. I want to start out with a huge thanks to the team over at CNC 3D. They have supplied us with a full Queenbee XYZ upgrade kit for the purpose of showing you how to install this on your own workbench machine. Alright, starting with our MGN15 rails, we are going to insert our M3 12mm screws, one in each hole, then screw an M3 drop-in T-nut, one turn on each of these screws. Now grabbing our Z-axis C-beam and clipping or holding our 3D printed guides in place. These will line up one rail and the other we will seat using our Z-plate. Line the T-nuts up and drop the rail in with equal spacing top and bottom. While holding the rail against the 3D printed guides, start at the two ends, making sure that the drop-in T-nut is rotating correctly during tightening to secure the rail, and work your way through the rest. Repeat the steps on the other side, only this time we are only going to tighten the top and bottom screws, as we will loosen them once we have the plate installed to line things up. Okay, now let's assemble our Z-plate. We're going to start with our Delrin nut block. If you don't already have two nylock nuts pressed into these, press them in by hand now. Two 35mm M5 screws with two 9mm spacers and two shims on each bolt. Then screw these through your Delrin nut blocks, leaving it a little bit loose until we get everything fitted. Continuing on, we're going to use our 8mm M3s here to secure the MGN15C block to our Z-plate. Make sure that you keep your retainers on here so as to not lose any of the ball bearings. Again, we will not tighten this down until we have them on the rails. Okay, let's slide these onto the rails. Slide them on, letting the retainers fall as the rails take their position. Once you get this started, you will need to align your Z lead screw with the Delrin nut block. Screw this in as you continue to guide the plate onto the rails. Now go ahead and tighten the M3s holding the bearing blocks. Once this is on and you're not noticing any binding, you can go ahead and tighten the linear rails. Move the plate along the rails as close as you can get to the screw that you're tightening to keep things aligned. You can go ahead and tighten down your Delrin nut block now. We can now put our bottom plate back on. Start by sliding our locking collar, then washer, then bearing on. Then our bottom Z plate and install the 4 screws. Once this is secured, slide your bearing down with your washer and press up on your lead screw. Press as hard as you can with one hand to remove any play, and then tighten your locking collar. Turn your coupler to give this a quick test and make sure that there is no binding. Let's reinstall our motor. We're going to be using our M5 50mm screws and our 40mm spacers. Once the motor is secure, you can tighten your coupler. Make sure that the set screw is against the flat part of the motor shaft, then tighten the outer M3 screws. And that's it for our Z-axis assembly. Onto our X C-beam. Let's start by preparing 2 of our linear rails. You'll also need 34 14mm M4 screws and 34 M4 drop-in T-nuts. Depending on the size of your machine, the numbers of these will vary. This part's pretty straightforward. You're simply going to install a screw in each hole and then do one full turn on the T-nut on the backside. Now line up the T-nuts long ways down the rail and then flip it over and place it into your C-beam. Place your 3D printed guides at each end of the C-beam and one in the middle, then run through all of the screws on this rail, tightening them down. Now pop your guides off and let's place the next rail on. We will use the guides again. This time we won't tighten down all of the screws, just the two ends and one in the middle. Okay, pop the guides off and let's get our bearing blocks. Making sure the retainers are still installed, line the bearing blocks up and slide them onto the rails, letting the retainers fall as it slides onto the rail. If you've elected to use grease nipples to pack these with grease after you have installed them, make sure that the nipples are facing outwards like I have done here. If you are not using them, make sure that you have pre-greased these blocks, as you won't be able to easily remove them after they have been installed. Okay, that's it. Let's set this aside and move on to our X assembly. First, we are going to use two 50mm M5 screws and three 9mm spacers with 4 shims on each. Again, pressing the nylock nuts into the Delrin nut blocks and screwing through this. We won't tighten these all the way down until they are installed. Okay, now grab the rail we just prepared and align your HDR blocks, installing one 12mm M4 in each and not tightening all the way down just yet. Now run through and install the rest of the 12mm M4 screws, and tighten the rest down. Let's use this to tighten the rail down now that we left loose. Working from one side to the other, moving the plate assembly along as you go nearest the screw you're tightening. Check the movement and make sure there's no binding. If there is, you might need to adjust these screws. Okay, moving on to our Y rails. Install your 14mm M4 screws with the T-nuts with just one turn on the backside again. Now we can slide our HDR blocks onto the rail, letting the retainers fall as we do this again. If you're using grease nipples, make sure they face outward so you'll be able to access them. If not, make sure these are pre-greased. Okay, now let's install our rail. With the T-nuts somewhat aligned, place the rail on the C-beam. You can use the top or the bottom of the C-beam. It is, however, recommended that you use the bottom to prevent any flex in the C-beam. As you can see here, I have actually used the top. I may go back and change this later. Tighten one of the T-nuts in the middle to hold the rail while you install the guides. Once they are installed, back off on this T-nut and press it against the guide and then retighten. Repeat this at the ends, then work your way through each screw until they are all tight. Pro tip, when you're tightening your T-nuts, sometimes they can fail to rotate into place. You'll be able to feel this in the screw as it will screw in a lot further than the others and you won't have any pulling force. If this happens, back the T-nut off all the way, keeping pressure on the screw. Then tighten it again and it should grab correctly. Moving on to our Y plates. Start off with our 55mm M5 screws with one 9mm spacer and 6 3mm spacers, plus 2 shims and 2 mini shims on each. The mini shims will go on last as they fit inside the recess in the Delrin nut block. Then place the Delrin nut block on top with your nylock nuts pressed into it. Again, not tightening all the way so we can snug this up after. Repeat on the other side of the plate as well. Install the Y plate onto the rail, line up the HDR blocks and install the 12mm M4 screws. Don't tighten them down until you have them all installed. Again, check that there's no binding. For the sake of the length of this video, go ahead and repeat the exact same steps on the other side of your machine. Once you have done this, let's continue with adjusting the frame of the machine to allow for the offset of the rails. Loosen the following screws at the front and back of the machine. It should just be 4 on the lower half of the Y C-beam plates and a 90° on the top. It's possible, depending on your build, that yours is slightly different. Once you have this loose, you're going to slide the rails inward a bit. If you have a 1000mm machine, you're going to aim for 865mm. Close is fine, as we are just going to do this to make installing the X C-beam a bit easier with one person. Okay, taking your X C-beam, install 2 T-nuts in the top back and bottom back of the C-beam. Don't mind that I have installed 4 in the top. I plan to add additional 90° connectors in the future. Now lift the X C-beam onto the machine, securing each end by placing one screw in a couple of turns. This should be enough to hold it in place while you install the rest. Go ahead and start the rest of the 16mm M5 screws and hold the C-beam in place, but don't tighten them all the way down just yet. Your 2040 extrusion, slide 2 T-nuts in the top and 2 in the bottom. Again, I've done 4 in the top, however I'll be adding more later. Now install your 20-40mm extrusion in the center holes using 2 M5 16mm screws on each end. Okay, on to tightening. If you have a set square big enough or an engineer square, you can place it against your Z plate as you tighten down the screws. This will give you a good start for when it comes time to tramming your machine. Work your way through each of the screws. When doing the 2040, place pressure to hold it against the C-beam. We will tie these together after. Repeat the same steps on the other side of the machine. Now install your 90-degree connectors. In my case, I'm doing 4 across the top. If you followed along, you will have room for 2 on the top and 2 on the bottom. Find your T-nuts and tighten these down evenly spaced across the rails. This is going to provide additional rigidity. Okay, let's check our machine is square. We want to see the same distance corner to corner. Move the machine around until you achieve this, then start tightening down the 4 screws on the Y C-beam plates on the front and back, and don't forget the 90-degree connectors. Now we can reinstall our Y lead screws. If you have the tingle tensioning system, you will slide your lead screw in and then place a bearing, washer, and then a locking collar. Thread this all the way to the Delrin nut block and screw through them both. As these are loose, you should not get any binding. Once you come out the other side, you're going to install the locking collar, washer, bearing, and slide it through the back plate. Then place your thrust bearing and your locking collar. There should be around 11mm stick out. Now tighten down your locking collar. Back to the front of the machine, we're going to install our thrust bearing, then our locking collar, then thread on our tensioning tool and apply some tension. Now we're going to tighten our locking collar. And lastly, remove our tensioning tool. Now make sure that the bearings are still seated on the inside and tighten the locking collar. You don't need any pressure here as these are just used to retain the bearings. If you don't have the tingle tensioning system, install these lead screws the same way that we did the Z-axis. Now go ahead and tighten down the set screw on your coupler, as well as the two outer M3 screws. Lastly, we can tighten the screws going to the wide Delrin nut blocks. That's it for the Y lead screw. Go and repeat the exact same steps on the other side of the machine. Now we're moving on to the X-axis lead screw. First, thread the lead screw in, then bearing, washer, locking collar. Once they're on, screw the lead screw into the Delrin nut block. When it is out the other side, install the locking collar, then the washer, then the bearing. Once we pop out the other side, we're going to install our thrust bearing and locking collar, leaving 11mm of stick out for your coupler and then tightening down your locking collar. Over to the other end, let's install our thrust bearing and locking collar. Then thread our tensioning tool, screw this on and apply some tension, then tighten the locking collar and remove the tensioning tool. Okay, check your bearings on the inside and make sure they are seated and slide their locking collars up and tighten them. And again on the other side. Lastly, you can tighten the screws going to your X-axis Delrin nut block, and that's it. Okay, if you have a drag chain, there are a few mounting options. I have designed some 3D printed mounts that support most of the drag chains that people are using, but you could quite simply drill holes if you need. If you're using these, you will need two 55mm bolts and three 10mm M4 screws. Choose the direction you need for your drag chain and go ahead and install the mount. This mount then screws into the holes at the back top of the X plate. The other end of the drag chain, install two 10mm M4 screws and two drop-in T-nuts. Then secure it to the top of the X C-beam as shown. I have also designed a mount that will fit cleanly onto the Y plate. You can use one 14mm M5 screw and one nylock nut to secure it, then three 10mm M4 bolts to secure your drag chain to the mount. Moving to the back of the machine, this last mount goes onto the 2040 extrusion. You'll need two 12mm M5 screws and two drop-in T-nuts, then three 10mm M4s. Okay, let's reinstall our X motor. Use the same spacers you had previously. These might differ depending on the lead screw setup you are using. As I am using the tinkled tensioning system, you can see that I have extra spacers in here. Make sure to slide your coupler in before you screw the motor in. Once you have that motor tight, tighten the coupler set screw against the flat spot on the motor shaft. Then tighten your two M3s and lastly the set screw against your lead screw. Okay, let's mate our Z assembly. You need four 16mm screws here. Simply align it to your Z plate and get these four screws started before tightening them down. There are end stop mounts included with the kit. Install the Z1 at the bottom of the ZC beam with the end stop facing upwards like so. Now for the Y end stop, use one 8mm screw and a drop-in T-nut. Drop this into the back of the YC beam and tighten down like so. Okay, now it's time to reinstall your spindle or router. Lower the Z-axis to just above the bed and slide your spindle or router in. Once you are happy with its placement, tighten down your mounts. If you need to, reinstall your water cooling and spindle cables.